I don't know if I have told you about a church up in Ohio somewhere. My uncle used to tell about a church where this happened, and I'm not sure whether it really happened or whether it was just an illustration that he used, but he said there was a church meeting and they split. Churches do that sometimes because they don't practice the love of Christ, and so they split, and they had a coal heater in the middle of the auditorium. That's what they used to heat with. Well, they didn't have the money to each one build their own building, and they just decided that one group would use it at one time on Sunday and another group would use it at a different time. They still used the same building, but they met at different hours. So naturally, there was the problem of buying the coal, and each group bought its own coal, and one put its coal pile on one side of the building and one on the other, and that didn't create a big problem, but they had a sign up over the front door of that church building, "One Lord, one faith, and one baptism." A little schoolboy coming home one day wrote up right under that, "and two coal piles." And that, whether it happened or not, illustrates what sometimes can happen among brethren where there is not a spirit of love. I announced in the bulletin that I'd be talking tonight about the relationship of one Christian to another. Often the Sadducees and the scribes and the Pharisees would come to Jesus and try to trap him. And that's what happens to any great leader. You know, you let one brother in the church get a little bit ahead of everybody else, and people start referring to him and quoting from him and talking about what a fine work he's doing. When people become like the scribes and the Pharisees, a lot of them do, and they try to cut him down. And that's what they were trying to do to Jesus. They were trying to cut him down to size and catch him in some flaw in his teaching or his reasoning. Well, on one occasion, Matthew chapter 22, verse 34, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, so he'd already silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Now here's an expert in the law, and he asked Jesus this question. He's hoping to trap Jesus. But the question is this: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Now, that's an important question. And that's a question which I believe very firmly has a great bearing on our living today, the life that we live. Which is the greatest commandment in the law? And I believe it has a great bearing on our life, because I believe that the greatest commandment of the law is still the greatest commandment for us, and that it is a part of Christ's new law. So look the way Jesus answered. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it." Now the Pharisee didn't ask for the second. Jesus was giving him above measure here. He was giving him more than he asked. The first one, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus gives the greatest commandment as loving God, loving the Lord with all our heart, soul, and mind. But the second, he says, is similar. It's like it. And here it is. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Now, in another context, the querist was treated with the story of the Good Samaritan, because he asked further. He said, "But who is my neighbor?" This second commandment is like the first, love your neighbor as yourself. But this fellow says, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus answered that by giving the story of the Good Samaritan. But I believe there is no commandment, or there are no two commandments, any more important for us today than these. And I don't believe these commandments have been supplanted. I believe they are still binding because brought over into the new law. Let's look. First of all, God's relationship to us and God's actions toward us have illustrated this great principle. Because in John chapter 3, verse 16, John says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." No greater love has ever been shown than that a person, that God would give his Son, or that one person would lay down his life for another as Jesus did for us in giving his own life on the cross. So we have the supreme example in God's love for us and also in Christ's love for us. Then in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul said this, "Now I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing." We've witnessed some people in our own lifetime who have given their bodies to be burned. There were some people a few years ago in Vietnam who were giving their bodies to be burned. Go out in the square, douse themselves with gasoline or some very flammable liquid and set themselves on fire. And someone else in one of the eastern communist countries did that. So there are people who are willing to give their own bodies to be burned for a political cause or a social cause. But Paul says if we do that and do not have love, love is not the motivation, then even that is useless. There's no purpose in it. And so Jesus was concerned both before his death and after his death, and is concerned now, most of all, about our relationship with each other. A few years ago, somebody said to me, "Jesus is the person sitting next to me." And I said, I looked at him and I wondered, well, now, how does that fit in the picture? If I were to say to you tonight that you are Jesus to me, you might ask yourself the same question. Or the person sitting next to you is Jesus to you. How can we say that? Because that's as close as you're going to get to Jesus in this life. And Jesus said in Matthew 25, "Inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you've done it unto me." And if you do not do whatever needs to be done, whatever kind work, whatever good deed, if you do not do that to the one next to you, or to the one who is your neighbor, then you have failed to do that to Jesus. And in that sense, Jesus to you is the one next to you, or is your neighbor. And I think that's a very sobering thought. But Jesus in John chapter 13 did his best. And I think his best was the best and was good enough to teach his disciples how important this matter of loving each other is. And look what he did. If we were to read all of the account in John 13, we would find him washing the disciples' feet. And we would find Peter objecting, and Jesus saying, "Well, if you don't let me wash your feet, then you don't have any part with me." And Peter said, "Then, well, wash me all over." Well, after that, Jesus was concerned about his disciples understanding the meaning of his washing their feet. So in verse 33 of John 13, he says, "My children, I will be with you only a little longer. Only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I'm going you cannot come. A new commandment I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." Now here he's talking about Christians' relationship to Christian. how we are to relate to each other, and how those people in that church where they had one Lord, one faith, and one baptism, but two coal piles, had not related to each other. You must love one another as I have loved you. All men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Is the converse true? Is the opposite of this true? That if we do not love one another as Jesus loved them and us, that all men will know that we are not his disciples? I don't see how that conclusion is avoidable. I believe that the one follows just as the other follows. If they will recognize us as his disciples because of the way we love one another, they will recognize us as not being his disciples by the way we fail to love one another. I have often quoted, and I hope I have many more opportunities to quote from Tertullian, who in his apology describes the effect of Christian love on pagans. Shortly after, just a couple of centuries after the New Testament church had been established, Tertullian said, "They say, you see how they love each other, because the pagans hate each other. And see how they are ready to die for each other, because they're more disposed to kill each other. Pagans kill each other. Pagans hate each other. Pagans do each other in and do each other before the other one is able to do them. Those are pagan guidelines and pagan moralities and pagan principles of action between themselves." But Tertullian had been impressed, and he was writing of how others had been impressed of the way Christians loved each other. But 2 centuries later, Chrysostom said, when a pagan sees a greedy Christian, avaricious, but who exhorts others to do the opposite, when the pagan sees the man to whom it was commanded to love even his enemies, treat his own relatives as beasts, the pagan will say his words are useless. We, said Chrysostom, we are the cause if they remain in error. They have long ago condemned their own doctrines, and similarly they admire ours, but they are hindered by our manner of life. So here we see two contrasting statements from two early writers, but if we wanted, we could look around today and find examples of the same thing, examples of those who greatly love each other and who grow in their love for each other, and examples of those also who hate each other and fail to practice the kind of love that Jesus mentioned. Well, in this passage that I've just noted, in John chapter 13, Peter was probably the one most hard-headed, the one who was last to accept this teaching. It was hardest for Peter to realize the meaning of Jesus' actions. And in verse 36, Simon Peter asked Jesus, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus had talked about going away. He couldn't stay with them always. So Peter, as always, he's the first one to speak up. He says, "Where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I'm going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And that's what Peter did. Peter vowed and declared a great love for Jesus, but he really was not firm in that declaration, in that conviction, and his actions proved him to be wrong. I believe that later Peter did have that kind of love for Jesus, and if tradition is correct, he died a martyr's death, demonstrating his love. But at this point, he hadn't understood, and he really hadn't been shaped and formed into a mature Christian. There are many, many passages, brethren, in the New Testament that teach that we are to love one another greatly. In Romans chapter 12, verses 9 and 10, love must be sincere. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. And I don't believe there is any commandment in all of Christianity any more important today than first to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and second, to love our neighbor as ourselves, and to love our brethren as we see here. In 1 John chapter 3, John, who often spoke of love, in verses 14 through 16 said, "We know that we have passed from death to life because we love our brothers. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life in him. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers." Think about that. How many people are there in this auditorium tonight that you would give your life for? That's what John's talking about. That we ought to be willing to lay down our lives for our brethren. Now, John makes a very significant statement here when he says, anyone who does not love remains in death. Paul said that though we give all our goods to the poor, though we give our body to be burned, though we speak with the tongues of men and of angels, if we don't have love, it doesn't amount to anything. Now let me say something else. Let me add to something that we're talking about here. Add something to it. If we are baptized and fail to love our brethren, what does it amount to? It doesn't amount to a thing. It doesn't even amount to a good bath. Suppose we are baptized and we sing and pray and take the Lord's Supper every time Christians meet. What does it amount to if we don't have love for our brethren? It doesn't amount to a thing. It's not worth a thing in God's sight. It is empty, because those who do not love remain in death. They remain in their previous condition of sin. I was shocked this week to hear about two different churches. One of them, I know some people there personally. I won't tell you where either one of these churches is. Neither one of them is close by. I'll leave it at that. I know a man who went to a place, and after he had been there a while, he came in contact with a sister in another congregation. Now follow this very closely. He came in contact with a sister in another congregation in the same town. It wasn't a big place. And this sister said to him, she said, "You know, we only have services on Sunday morning in the congregation where I meet." And she said, "We don't have the opportunity to study the Bible either on Sunday evening or Wednesday evening." And he said, "Well, why don't you come and meet with us on Sunday evening and Wednesday evening?" And she said, "Well, I'd like to do that." And she did. And she brought another lady with her. She didn't have a car. She didn't have a way to get there. But she came in a taxi. And then some of the brethren gave these two ladies a ride home. Well, now, this brother who invited them was heavily reprimanded. Heavily reprimanded. A little later, this church where the two ladies had been meeting, their building burned down. It burned down, I believe, on a Saturday night. They had no place to meet on Sunday morning. And this preacher brother I'm telling you about came to know about it, and he said, why don't you all come over and meet with us tomorrow morning for worship? And they did. And that caused a lot of trouble. And there was a brother in that congregation who said, I'm going to get rid of that preacher. And he even accused the preacher of setting fire to the building of that other congregation. And he says, I have incontrovertible proof that he set fire to their building just so they would come over and worship with us. Finally, this preacher stayed for about another year after that, and finally he could take it no longer. And he decided to leave. And the last day, his last Sunday there, this fellow who vowed that he'd get rid of him came. And he said, he was telling everybody, he says, I told you I'd get rid of him. I told you I'd get rid of him. Wound up, there was a fight on the church grounds. This man drew a knife, and they took it away from him. And then he said, I've got something that'll get you. So he says, I'll go to my car and get my gun. And he did. Fortunately, nobody was shot. Now, this actually happened. You know the trouble? You know the problem? Those two sisters were black. That congregation that was invited to come over and meet with this other congregation, they were black. That was the whole problem. And this brother was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Now there was the problem. That's a shame, isn't it? And this same brother, when he left this place, told me of another congregation where I have been personally and am acquainted with some of the elders, where there were some people there who got it in for the preacher and vowed to get rid of him. They kept coming. And as they would go out the door, or one would say to him, my, that tie looks lousy with that suit. And they continued to harass him, and he lasted very short time. Now, these are illustrations from a preacher's standpoint. And I know they're extreme, but they illustrate the point of what Christianity is not all about. They illustrate how we are not to relate to each other. They're just the opposite. The importance of love between Christians is shown over and over and over again in the Scriptures. And it wouldn't be possible, if we took all night tonight, it wouldn't be possible for us to read all of the passages that have to do with love. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 2, Paul said, be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. That's a wonderful spirit when it exists among brethren. And I believe that's the kind of spirit that exists here in Channelview. But I think we need to warn each other. I think we need to be aware of what goes on in the world and of what is not Christian and what can happen. And we need to avoid it ever happening among us. We need to be Christian in the things that we do and in the things that we say. And we need to be sure that we always have the best interest of our brethren at heart when we talk with them or when we talk about them. Paul said in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10 that we are to be ready always to help our neighbors, but especially those who are of the household of faith. He says, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. Romans chapter 12, verse 13. Back to the passage that I was reading from a moment ago. Just a few verses down. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. James chapter 4 and verse 11. Brothers, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against his brother or judges him speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. Verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. Then in chapter 5, verse 9 of this same writing, don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Then in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul has some very important counsel to Christian people everywhere. If any one of you has a dispute with another, dare he take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. I say this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? But instead, one brother goes to law against another, and this in front of unbelievers. So the Corinthians had a great deal to learn about this as well. There will always be problems in the church. There'll never come a time when we'll be without problems. But we need to be mature in the way we handle problems. We need to remember Jesus' statement that if we have something against a brother, we are to go to him. If a brother has something against us, he is to come to us. And there is a double guarantee built in. If I have done something against a brother over here, I am duty bound according to Jesus to go to him. If he has done something to me, I am duty bound to go to him. This brother cannot sit and say, he did the wrong, I'm waiting for him to come. And this brother cannot sit and wait and say, he did the wrong, and I'm waiting for him to come. Each one has the responsibility to go to the other, no matter who has committed the wrong. You know why? You know the wisdom in that? Because this brother may have done something to harm this brother without this brother realizing it. And so if this brother has the responsibility to go to him and talk to him about it, then there is a double guarantee that it will be taken care of. I think another Christian attribute, even from the verses that we have noticed, is the attribute of humility and approachability. We never want to get to the point to put ourselves so much on a pedestal that people are afraid to come to us, or that people hesitate to come to us. We need to be condescending, all of us, each one toward the other. Elders need to be condescending toward the flock, toward each other. The preacher needs to be condescending. Deacons need to be condescending. We all need to be condescending to each other. In other words, willing to hear each other out and talk matters over and come to a reasonable conclusion. These, I think, are the only conclusions that we can reach in view of the teachings that we have read from the Scriptures tonight. Let us grow to love one another in such a way that people in Channelview will say those people really are disciples of Christ. Those people are Christians. I don't believe for a moment that this means that we are to be wishy-washy. I don't believe it means that we are to condone evil in our midst. I believe that we can take a very firm stand against evil, and I think we should, always. If we know of someone who is doing something against God's will and bringing reproach on the church, we need to go to that person. We need to be willing to even to exclude that person from the fellowship of the church, because that's Bible teaching. And so even though these things tonight have not been designed primarily to teach one how to become a Christian, or perhaps to encourage someone to come back to the Lord, we want to encourage you to do that. We want the song that has been announced as the song of encouragement, the song of invitation, to be taken in that vein. And if you are subject to the invitation that Jesus extends always to us, we hope you'll come tonight. Whatever spiritual need you may have, whatever problem there might be that we can assist you with, we hope you'll come at this time as we stand together.